You know the day destroys the night, night divides the day. Try to run, try to hide, break on through to the other side. Break on through to the other side. Break on through to the other side.
God bless America. Welcome to The Ranch, everybody, the podcast where we explore the people and happenings of Dry Creek Ranch, Eagle, and the greater Boise area. Quick business shout out. I actually have two, and the first one goes to a business I've never used, but they win the prize for the best advertising near Costco. I pick up my own dog poop, but man, if I needed one, I'd call these guys for sure. Anyway, I thought that was great. And the other one is the VR1 Amusement Center. VR1 is over in Eagle, and I've been there several times now, once for somebody else's birthday party and then once for my son's birthday party. They allow you to bring your own food and drink. They have 7 stalls. You can rent out the VR experience as a group and take the whole place, or you can rent out individual stalls, which is really cool. So if you just want to go there with like one person, or I'm planning on taking, like my son individually or my son's, a couple times, you don't have to take the entire place, but it's a really cool setup. The people there are super helpful. I've done the VR experience several times now. I really like it. I think it's really, really awesome. So it's wonderful for birthday parties. It's wonderful if you just want to take, your kids or your friends out and go just do silly things for a little bit. But again, I really enjoy it. So check it out. Again, it's called VR1. This is the contact information. I really enjoy them. My guest today is the head winemaker at Horse Ranch Vineyards. He has been in the wine industry since he graduated college, worked at Robert Mondavi, worked at a couple other places, and now finds himself here with about 40 years of winemaking experience. He was very kind and didn't bring some of his Boast wine, which I thought was, frankly, like some of the best wine I've ever had. And he was just great to talk to, and again, understanding what goes into the production of the wine, understanding how he deals with a much more difficult climate than, say, California, and still produces world-class wine was a real treat. And I think you're going to enjoy it too. So without further ado, the man, the myth, the legend, Corey Sprott. So Corey, thank you for coming, sir. I appreciate you. Thanks for making the time.
Having me.
Yeah. How was your Christmas?
It was good. The most of the family's out of town, so we spent it with some friends, and they had a lot of people there, so it was a good time.
Now, when you say out of town, is it like out of state, out of town, or like just somewhere else, like Idaho City? Or
No, back in California.
Oh, okay.
I'm from California. My son, one of my sons, lives here, but he was back in California for the holidays, and along with the rest of the family.
Man, the train wreck of travel that is unfolding now.
Oh,
I have several friends that live in the neighborhood, dear friends of mine, and they are literally sourcing options to get a chartered jet back. They're trying to get back for work. They got families. Right. One of them is a family of 6, and one of them's a family of 5 with an infant. And they spent, it was something like a day or two at the airport trying to get flights back. And now they're going to be delayed, until Friday or Saturday.
I've got a friend in Austin that's supposed to be here yesterday, and he's not getting here until Thursday.
Right. So the collapse, this is what somebody was actually saying. They're like the collapse of Southwest in particular, because that's what these guys were flying. The logistics for these airlines are they're unfathomable, right? Like the planes coming, the going, the maintenance schedules, all that stuff. They're like, this collapse actually may be the end to some degree for Southwest. Like it may take them 6 months to fully recover from all of the delays and the passengers, the lost revenue. It's going to be a dark time.
I heard they canceled all but one flight into Boise yesterday.
Yeah, nobody's getting back.
Yeah.
That's terrible. So you've been in the wine industry for some time.
Oh, yeah. I always say I've been in the wine industry since before electricity, but actually I got out of college in 1979. So I've been in it a bit.
Did you start before? I mean, because for me, look, when I was in high school, you were mentioning the Weber kettle before we got going. I loved my Weber kettle in high school. My mom got me this big, it was like just over the standard size, and it had one of the levers on the bottom that moved all 3 of the vents at once, and there were these, the triple vent.
Sounds like the one I still have.
Yeah, I thought it was pretty awesome with it. And the technology itself is just really just tried and true. So anyway, I barbecued like crazy in high school, and I will confess we definitely drank beers and stuff, but towards the end of my high school, and right before I left for college, a buddy of mine and I would get together once a week, and we'd get a beer, like a different beer we had never tried before. We'd barbecue, and we would start, we'd watch like old ridiculous films, right? And it doesn't really matter what the film was, but that was my first that was my first entrance into kind of cooking and enjoying beverages and really getting after it. And of course, I had my dumb high school and college time where I got too drunk on things, but that was probably, I was about 18. It was the first time I'm like, oh, you can really, like, there's nuance with food and beverage. I didn't grow up in like a super cultured, family where, like we had like wine pairings with dinner or anything. But so my question is, was your entrance into the wine world really when you graduated college, or had you always had a taste and kind of a fondness for the drink?
A little bit of both, actually. My father was an orthodontist, and I was supposed to be the orthodontist designate in the family. I didn't want to be an orthodontist, so I was going to become a doctor. Got into my freshman year of college and decided I didn't want to be a doctor, and now I have my biochemistry major with no real direction. The guy who lived across the hall from me was a winemaking. He was an enology major. And we started, getting together and drinking beer. And, the bell rings. It says, I'm from Napa Valley. My family drinks wine. This makes a lot of sense. So I changed my major, got into the wine industry, and that's how it started.
And where were you going to school at the time?
UC Davis.
My dad went to UC Davis.
Great school.
Yeah. In fact, he did chemistry as well. He graduated, I think, in 79 or 80. I was born when he was in medical school at USF. Or UCSF. I don't know. Mike Todd, ring a bell? Probably not.
No.
No.
But he's the same age as me then.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. That's wild time. So you graduate, you switch from biochem to, what is it, viticulture? Enology. And then what? You go directly back to Napa?
So I got out, graduated, went to work at Robert Mondavi, worked there for 3 seasons. The first season was in the research department where I used most of the things that I'd learned, and it was all right. And then I went back the second season working in the cellar, which turned out to be one of the greatest educations of my life, because working at a place where learning things that you didn't otherwise know from school, and in a place where they do it right the first time was pretty amazing.
What do you mean, do it right the first time?
Robert Mondavi Winery had been around long enough at the time and had been run by real professionals, and their experimentation in the cellar was over. They didn't, when they taught young kids like me how to do stuff, they taught us how to do it. We spent a lot of time teaching me, just as a seasonal cellar worker, how to do things right. And that's what I mean by it. They didn't go cheap on it. They didn't cut corners. They did it right the first time.
That's especially in a world that's so there's a new business experimentation. So it used to be that, like the 70s and 80s, when you're coming out with a business plan, the idea was that you figure out what the business plan is, you get it just right, and then you implement, right? But obviously this leads to some degree of analysis paralysis. So you have a lot of people, especially entrepreneurs, that keep trying to perfect the product. But in the I think it was the mid thousands, people, especially with the .com and innovation happening so quickly, people moved away from that model, which is, get it right the first time, and they move more, get something out, get feedback, and then A/B test infinitely. There's a point in case, there's a cookie company. I can't remember exactly what it's called, but very popular in Utah and a couple other states. Drive-through cookies, the whole thing. And it's like, how could a cookie company have drive-through? But they do. So they have these like drive-throughs where people roll up and they get these massive cookies. And their model is essentially that they have a pretty good chocolate chip. Okay, and the chocolate chip is the thing they test everything else against. So then they were doing like door deliveries, all kinds of different things, changing different recipes and different cookies on a weekly basis. And they would always test it against this chocolate chip that never changed. So they were able to A/B test an infinite number of times with different recipes and essentially weed through different ideas and come up with like a really dynamite menu for, cookies. But that's pretty much the exact opposite of it sounds like what you guys were doing, or at least you were on the back end of it.
Well, I think, at that point, the industry itself was still going through a lot of growing pains. And I think that when I said by getting it right the first time, I mean that they were getting it right to the technology of the time and to the techniques of the time. The techniques of winemaking have changed a lot since the early 80s in California and throughout the United States. and we've all grown. And one of the interesting things that I think I've observed over the last almost 40 years is that we've gone more and more and more back to traditional French winemaking, as opposed to what we were doing in the 70s and 80s, which was very technological. We were eschewing wood tanks for stainless steel tanks and completely filtering wines early on in their lives. And I think it's come to pass that we've all kind of realized, for the most part, when you're making premium wines, that the French really did kind of know what they were doing.
So what is it about the Romans understood concrete and building far better than anyone, at least that appeared before or after, for a long time. And they still have, recipes for concrete and certain mixes that we don't understand, right? What is it about the French or the history of the French industry that led to them having the winning recipe well before they had technology to learn otherwise?
I think it was just time. They'd been at it for 150 years, and in California we'd really been at it for 20. There were wineries before that, but the real commercialism in the wine industry in California didn't start until the 60s. So I think it was just a matter of experience.
Okay, but wine has been around since Jesus. What do you mean 150 years?
It wasn't very good then either.
What do you mean?
Well, there wasn't a lack of there was a lack of understanding of how to prevent microbial degradation of the wines, microbial spoilage. You basically took grapes and you smashed them with your feet and you fermented it and you drank it.
Okay.
Nothing special. We had no sterile bottling. We didn't have pasteurization. They didn't have anything that would allow you to put the wine in the bottle and let it keep for a long time. So it was a totally different animal. Yes, they've been making wine all that long, but it really was not what we consider wine to be these days.
What happened 150 years ago in France then?
They started understanding that if you keep wine away from oxygen, if you keep the containers full, if you let all of the fermentation, the various fermentation processes finish so that there's no more food for the bacteria, the yeast to eat, that you could go ahead and then bottle and it would keep for a long time, because basically you've gotten rid of all the food for the bacteria.
So then obviously the flavor and the nature of the chemical doesn't change.
No, it's really just a matter of understanding how wine spoilage works and how you prevent it. These days we sterile filter everything before bottling. Now there are a lot of people who do unfiltered wines, and there's some real value to that. I'm not a big proponent of it, because every time you put an unfiltered wine in a bottle, you're taking a risk, and my job as the winemaker for Horse Ranch Vineyards is partly to avoid risk.
Is unfiltered sake similar to, because I've never had an unfiltered wine, but I have had unfiltered sake before. And, it obviously has look, I don't have the vocabulary that you do, but it obviously has it's a different experience going through a bottle of unfiltered sake.
To be honest with you, I don't know enough about sake to be able to answer the question. It's possible that they pasteurize it, or it's possible that they're just fermenting it completely dry and there's just no possibility for anything to go wrong with it once it's in the bottle. I don't know the answer.
Gotcha. So with the unfiltered wines, you're talking about risk. What is the risk? What happens? Are you just a crapshoot if the wine comes out like vinegar, or?
Well, hopefully, if you're going to unbottle unfiltered wine, it's completely dry. The fermentation has gone completely through. There's no sugar left. There's a secondary fermentation called malolactic fermentation that converts malic acid into lactic acid, and it also puts out a lot of secondary metabolites, which is what gives Chardonnay its buttery character, for instance.
Okay.
And so you also need to be sure that the malic acid has been 100% converted to lactic acid, so that those bacteria have no more food to continue on with their fermentation. And then lastly, and for me most importantly, there's a critter that runs around the winery. It's a small yeast called Brettanomyces, and it's very insidious and hides in barrels and hides in wood, and can pop up in the barrel, or it can pop up 2 years down the road in the bottle. and it's very, very difficult to control without filtration. We've learned a lot, excuse me, about cleaning barrels and how to keep barrels sanitary and steaming them to get rid of the Brettanomyces. And it's a lot easier to, I think, keep it out now, but that possibility always exists. When I was a very young man in my first job at Robert Mondavi Winery, one of my jobs on a weekly basis was to set up tastings. And one of the things that we tasted every month was filtration experiments. And we had the 1969 Robert Mondavi Reserve Cabernet and the 1974 Robert Mondavi Reserve Cabernet. And they had bottles, some of it filtered and some of it unfiltered. And so every month, literally every month, we tasted these two wines. That was when I actually got to sit down and do tastings with Bob Mondavi, which was pretty cool. And my part of my job was to do the statistical tracking of it. So even though I only had that job for 6 months, I got to see all of the results from all of the time of the whole experiment for both wines. And essentially what we were doing was determining preference. It's called a duo-trio test, where you have 3 wines, 2 of them are the same, one is different. If you're able to pick out the different one, then your comments about the differences are valid. If you can't pick out the different one, then your comments are not valid. It's pretty common in most tastings and in a lot of other things. And so what they tracked over the years was preference of which wine was preferred, the filtered, the unfiltered. And with both of those wines, it was very, very clear that for the first year to 2 years, the unfiltered was preferred. For the next 2 to 3 years, there was little to no difference in preference between the two. And from 5 years on, the filtered wine was preferred. And that was because of the unfiltered wine was starting to have little tiny bits of spoilage going on because it hadn't been filtered. Whereas the filtered wines didn't have the bacteria or yeast in them. And so they continued on the aging process like you would expect.
Man, that's wild. So there's an aspect of art, and that could be, music, it could be painting, it could be, food. But there's an aspect of art that's always amazed me in that the people that get really good at producing art become the machine themselves, right? So like if you're a singer, right, like your vocal cords are your machine, that's what you're producing. And for you, it sounds like you had to go through this process, not entirely surprising, but it's kind of wild to think about it. It's like you had to slowly cultivate your palate and develop a nuance and ability to understand the differences and then actually affect that with science and chemistry.
The saying that I came up with some time ago about the art of winemaking, and it doesn't cover all of it, but it covers enough of it, is that the art of winemaking is understanding how and when to apply the science. And what I mean by that is if you make wine purely by the science, you'll never get anything done. You're always analyzing. You're always running statistical analysis. You're constantly tinkering with the wines, and you'll never get anything done. You'll spend all your time trying to do that. The flip side to that is making wine by the seat of your pants. And I know a lot of people who make their wine completely by the seat of their pants. Some of them are very good at it. Some of them are not. And so to me, the real art there is the whole scientific part of the analysis and understanding what the analysis means and what to do with it once you have that understanding that's the art. Does this wine really have to have this now, or can it wait? It's also understanding that deciding to do nothing is a conscious decision.
That very much reminds me of the saying about music, that the music is the space between the notes. That people try to fill, silences with something because they think that something they're filling it with is gonna make the music. But in reality, it's the space between the interruption of silence that actually leads to music. I was a rower in college, and our rowing coach would always tell us that because, look, anybody can pull on an oar. You can put your blade in the water, you pull on the oar, anybody can do that. But the flip side of it is, can you relax enough in the recovery of the stroke where you're not pouring, where you're sliding back forward to the point where you actually gain momentum in the recovery? And then, yeah, you hammer on the oar, everybody's big and strong, but can you relax enough so you don't completely explode halfway through the race? Because that's, when you're dealing with a rowing boat, you have 2,000 pounds of, man going back and forth on this, shell that's only about this wide, and you're balancing these, the 10-foot oars across the water. So there's a lot that can happen, but it's the relaxation and faith in the process as you go back to the catch, where you put your blade back in the water, that makes it. So it's so interesting to hear you talk about it. It's like, look, you need to know when not to do something, right? Just allow the process to happen. You
used the word faith, and I think you have to have a certain amount of faith in your knowledge, in your understanding, in your experience, to say, I can leave this alone. I don't need to do anything with it now. This can sit here for 2 or 3 or 4 months before I have to do anything to it. And wines are better for it. Really, they say that wines are made in the vineyard, and it's really true. For the most part, Cabernet Sauvignon is one of those wines where if you grow really good grapes, your job is don't screw it up as a winemaker. Chardonnay is a whole nother animal. Chardonnay is a winemaker's wine. You can make it any number of different ways, but really, your job is to take what you've got, don't screw it up.
Now, you talk about really good grapes. All right, I actually have some very odd connections with this. A very dear friend of mine had he and his wife were part of an appellation in Lodi, the Van Ruten appellation, and they in the mid 2000s. Before the 2008 crash, they were doing dealings with the Chinese wine industry, because China in general has this like massively growing middle class. Okay, so you have people coming in off of fields, living in contemporary homes, and again, they're all flooding into these cities, and they're growing this massive taste for a lot of Western things. It's like, McDonald's, beer, wine, whatever the, we produce. And wine is one of those things that the Chinese just don't really get yet. They're very good. He told me when he was over there dealing with a lot of these like kind of captains of industry in the food and beverage industry in China. He's like, look, they understand tea. It's like you go to a Chinese tea house and it's warm and it's inviting, and there's such a feel there, and you understand that there's thousands of years of history of making this tea just right. It's like, but you go to a wine place and they got the wines with the corks up, not Corktown. They don't drink it by the glass; they shoot it. He's like, he went to this large kind of embassy spot, and
or they mix it with 7-Up.
Yeah, they mix it with like this absurd. He's like, the wine is so bad. This guy literally goes around, and he was trying to be polite, and this Chinese guy goes around and pours a shot for everyone at the table. And there were 8 of them traveling on this bus throughout China, and he like shoots. He's like, it's literally just absurd. And so he shows me these pictures of these vineyards. Like the grapes here, and the agriculture is so different because they actually take the vines and they bury them throughout the winter seasons, and then they uncover them, get them back up. He's like, but the grapes are just, he's like, they're out there. He's like, they're not producing anything even close to what you're producing in, say, California, right? No matter where you go in California. It's like California in general has pretty good wine. At least that's my understanding. So what is the difference between growing there in China, growing in Idaho, and growing in California? Because one of the most impressive aspects of your vineyard is that you're state bottled, right? Like you grow the grapes.
We are a state
whole
bottled
thing.
We are state bottled. We have a few wines where we've, I think the last one was the 2016 Riesling, where we purchased the grapes. But other than that, all of our wines that we've bottled since we opened the winery have been estate wines.
And again, to be very clear, that means you are going from like dirt to grape to bottling, like the whole thing, and then you deliver it out of the winery.
Since we opened the winery up a year and a half ago, almost 2 years ago now, everything that we've bottled has been estate bottled. Before that, when we had our friends down in Sunny Slope making our wines for us, we weren't able to call it estate bottled, even though we controlled the process from start to finish. It was at somebody else's winery, so it wasn't estate bottled. We are now 100% estate bottled.
Okay, so the distinction between Napa Valley in California and Boise, Idaho, help me understand that as far as as far as growing? Because I mean, this is a totally different experience.
It is. The growing season is shorter. Spring, we bud out here in April, and they bud out in California no later than the 1st of March. So I've seen it as early as the end of January. So the growing season, and we harvest about the same time. So the growing season is much shorter. We do sort of make up for it by having longer days I think on a month either side of the summer solstice, the days average an hour and 20 minutes longer than they do in Northern California. So we do get some more sunshine that way. But I think the real difference is the winters and how we deal with the winters and the damage that we get from the occasional hard freezes. 2017 was a year that there were very few grapes grown in Idaho made into wine. We were one of the few that we had a few grapes survive, and we made a few wines in 2017. But there was it hit the Idaho wine industry horribly because there was a hard freeze in November of 2016 that the vines weren't completely dormant yet, so there's still a lot of moisture up in the canes and up in the trunk. And if you get down into the -5, -10 range for any period of time, you get to the point where you're going to start to see trunk splitting because what water is in the trunk and in the canes is going to freeze, and as water expands as it freezes and it splits the trunks out. So tremendous amount of damage from that. There was a similar process earlier in the decade. We had a little bit of damage we had a hard freeze in October of 2019 that caused a little bit of damage. And that's not your typical frost damage like you might see on the West Coast. This is actually hard freeze damage. We also get frost here at times. We had if you remember, we had a snowstorm on May 9th this year, and we had a 25-degree day after that, which is unheard of to have frost in May. And it caused a lot of damage to the buds. Now, that didn't damage the vines permanently, but it did damage this year's crop. We had a little bit of damage from that, not much.
So going from Napa then, like what are the because you're talking about minimizing risk, right? And here you're living in a far riskier environment for this type of agriculture. So is there anything that you can do to actually mitigate that, or is it more of just kind of tolerating the risk in pursuit of an Idaho wine?
I think that's a choice that every vineyardist needs to make. In Walla Walla, they bury their vines. They bury the canes like they do here now. The Walla Walla Valley is very flat, and when it gets cold there, it gets really cold there. We don't bury our vines, and the reason we don't is we're on a good slope. And one of the recommendations that I have for anybody who wants to plant a vineyard in Idaho is make sure that you've got a southeast to southwest facing slope. You got at least a 5% grade, and then the cold air will flow past your vines. One of the interesting lessons that we learned years ago is Gary put in a vineyard, and at the bottom of the vineyard he left the sagebrush. Well, he found out that the sagebrush, the cold air, comes up against the sagebrush and backs up into the vineyard and causes cold damage into the vineyard. You rip out the sagebrush so that the cold air will keep flowing on through, and you don't have that damage. So there's just a lot of things to do to protect yourself from the cold, but that's how we deal with it is having our grapes on a slope.
Man, that is wild. You just kind of blew my mind a little bit. I did hear an interview with Danica Patrick years ago, because she was, of course, when she was getting out of NASCAR, people approach her and they're like, well, look, you're not a NASCAR person anymore. You need to be like a wine person because you have a good story and you can find some good grapes, and that's what you need to sell wine. And she was talking about the difficulty of finding flatter land in California. She's like, you can only plant so much when you have a certain slope, and anything past, like, I don't know if it was 10 degrees or something, but it's a problem. But you guys are actually looking for sloped land.
Sloped land that's still, you don't have to terrace. I mean, it's 3 to 5% where you've got a good slope, but you can still walk up and down it. You can still run a tractor up and down it. I think that the owners, Gary and Martha, found just the absolute and it was purely by chance. The absolute just pinnacle of grape growing ground in Idaho, because it's got this beautiful south-facing slope. The rows are in a north-south orientation, so they get lots of sun from sun up to sundown. There's a ridge behind to the north, which gives us a little bit of shade right in the middle of summer and cools us off a little bit. It's just this absolute mecca of grape growing that they stumbled upon when they bought the property.
That's okay. The blistering summers, like this last summer was pretty hot.
August was miserable.
Right. Do you guys fear the summers the same way you would fear the winters? Like, does it get to a point where, like, look, we're at 106 for a month or something, and that's going to destroy the crop as well?
It doesn't destroy the crop. What it does is it shuts the vines down. And so when you hit about 102, 103 degrees, at some point, all plants will shut down it's called their stoma. It's the pores with which they take in carbon dioxide, put out oxygen, and also water transpires through it. So in order to prevent too much evaporation, they actually close these pores. And in the process of closing the pores to preserve water, it also stops photosynthesis. So, when we got a 106 degree day, if it hits 102 at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, you're done for the day. It's the same as if the sun had gone down. The photosynthesis stops. So that's the problem, because here, where we have a shorter growing season anyway because of the late spring, I frankly was really nervous. This particular year, we started, because of the cold and rainy April and May we were almost 4 weeks behind when the growing season started. And then when we had that hot August, I'm sweating bullets wondering, are we even going to be able to get this ripe? And, and then once August was over, September and October's weather was just absolutely stunning. It was perfect grape growing weather.
It was great.
So,
I mean, I don't know about grape growing, but I loved September and October. It was fantastic outside.
Yeah, it was, 80 degrees and just absolute perfect grape growing weather. We got all of our grapes ripe, made some great wines this year. But honestly, there was a point there in August I was a little nervous.
Coming back to the idea of faith, when did you really start to develop the belief in your process and in yourself in this whole system? Because it sounds, I mean, the things you're saying, I have never, ever, ever heard of. Not just with growing grapes, but like I had no idea that plants shut down. Like there are all kinds of problems with it, obviously. But I just feel like listening to you, I would get to a point where it's like, well, I'll never learn this. It's just too much. Like how long were you in this before you finally were able to look at a season and say, okay, look, if this happens, I'm going to do this. If this happens, I'm going to do this. And, these things are very easily manageable. And, if the worst should come, this is what we'll do. Like when did you have a full playbook?
I worked at a winery called William Hill long before Gallo bought it for a number of years. And if you've responsibility without authority, if you've ever heard that term, I had a lot of responsibility without authority, and I was responsible for making the wines were good, but I had a boss, not the owner, but I had a boss who was an absent boss, so he had all the authority, but he was never there, so it fell on me to make it right, and that was kind of where it started. Was I was nervous about making the wrong decision, but somebody had to make the decision, so I did. Right. And then I went through a number of other years, other jobs, doing other things, and I think I started getting more and more confidence. And then in 2000, when I became the winemaker at Napa Cellars, which was a satellite winery of Rombauer and Frank family, I was on my own. I can't use the language that Colonel Rombauer used when he told me to go down there and make great wines.
And you were about 43 at this time?
Yeah. So 2000, I was in my 40s. And I got there, and it just all clicked. It was just, everything. I did everything from walking the vineyards, picking decisions, all the way through all of the decisions through the winemaking. When we decided we wanted to make more wine of a certain variety, for instance, I'd go talk to Mr. Rombauer, who was my boss, and say, yeah, I think I'd like to buy 5 more tons of cab. And he goes, okay, go find it. So I'd go out and I'd source through the grape growers and find a vineyard of cab that I wanted to buy. And as long as it wasn't exorbitantly priced, he'd sign the contract. And so I was given this tremendous freedom to make wine and do it my way. And I felt a huge amount of pressure to make sure I was getting it right. And I did. So that built my confidence.
When you say you get it right, okay, I actually, one of my clients were the grandchildren of Franzia, and also the winemaker who took Charles Shaw and made it very, very popular. Because the original Charles Shaw,
right,
they were telling me, it's like, look, the guy was kind of struggling, the got bought out, the name got bought out, and then he made it really popular. And
right.
Charles Shaw, to me, look, I don't know if it's like, I remember drinking it in college. Somebody's like, yeah, this stuff is great. It's like $2, $3.
$2 chuck.
$2 chuck, baby. At Trader Joe's, like, let's go get a case and enjoy some. And I was like, all right, great. And people talked a lot about it even then. And I think I was 22 at the time. They're like, this wine is actually good enough that it's disrupting the, wine industry a little bit because it's so reasonably priced and the quality is good enough that it's doing really, really well. So when you say, look, I'm able to make really good wine, how are you gauging whether your wine is good? Is it solely by sales? Is it solely by who you respect, who tastes it? And it's like, Chris is like, hey, I love this. It's great. You're like, all right, Chris said it's good wine. Or is it like a combination of both?
Well, and also comparative tastings. It's all of the above. If you come to a realization early on in a winemaker's life that you're not making wine for you, you're making wine for the people who are shelling out the money for it. And that's, I think, most every winemaker's gone through that maturation process there. We all start out trying to make what we want to make and realizing that it doesn't matter what we like.
Right.
I'm fortunate in that for the most part in my career, my tastes have lined up with the consumer's taste. But if your tastes don't line up with the consumer's taste, you can make fabulous wine. If it doesn't sell, it's not going to do you any good because it's not going to pay the bills. But back to your question about how do you compare yourself? It's really comparative tastings, wine sales. And comparing yourself to similarly priced wines. When I was making a $30 bottle of Cabernet at Napa Cellars, I wasn't trying to compare it to Opus One at $150. I was trying to compare it to other wines that were selling from $30 to $50 or $30 to $60. And I was very proud of the fact that my wines, even though they were about 75% the cost of competitive wines, were competitive.
So I've wondered this for a long time, and again, please excuse my ignorance. When you talk about a $10 bottle of wine versus a $20 bottle of wine versus a $100 bottle of wine, I assume some of that is the cost of labor in the winemaker, right? Like a very, very, very famous winemaker likely charges more, and some of it. But what's the bulk of the cost? Is it actually the grapes?
A lot of it is the grapes, but honestly, when you get to that, I would say now we're in the $120 to $120 range, and you start seeing wines that are selling for $300, $400, $500. Those are wines that are just not available. They're very limited production, and you're paying for that limited availability. You're paying what the market will bear for it. It's not necessarily a reflection of the intrinsic value of the wine, but of more of the availability of it.
And what the consumer values it at.
Yes.
That's just the bottom line.
Right.
So being one of the few estate bottled wines, I have to imagine yours is exceptionally, there are limited people to compare it against.
There are. I think there's quite a number of people in Idaho doing some real fabulous jobs with their wines, and that is who we obviously compare ourselves against. I actually think our wines compare very well to the Napa and Sonoma wines that I was making back in the day, because when I first came out here, it wasn't my first trip to Idaho. We've friends out here for years, but my first trip out here to Three Horse Ranch, we had meetings all day. We were meeting with architects and engineers and talking about the winery being built. And finally I said, well, let's sit down and taste your wines. So the tasting room had shut down. It was after 6. Everybody got home. And we sat down and we tasted through all of their wines. And that was what sealed the deal for me to want to move out here. Because, I mean, I'd been to Texas and tasted wines in Texas. And they're great wines for Texas. And
Great wines for Texas.
For Texas.
For Texas.
Right. And, and I didn't want to make great wines for Idaho. I wanted to make great wines. And the wines that I tasted, this was in the summer of 2019, so it was some of the 18 whites and some of the 16 and 14 reds. And I was blown away by the quality of wines. And that's why I'm here, because the wines were so good. And I knew that I could take that ball and run with it and make some marginal improvements, and maybe some even more than marginal improvements.
So it was actually the fact that the wines were already very good that attracted you. Because I truthfully, what I thought you were going to say is that you were like, look, I could see obvious value I could bring right away. That was like, these wines were good Idaho wines, but I could make them, better than that. But you already felt like they were, the starting point was high.
You can, when you taste a wine, you can taste the grapes, you can taste the vineyard, you can taste the source of it, and you can taste the winemaker's touch. Our wines were being made by Koenig Wines out in Sunny Slope, and Greg is a very, very talented winemaker. So, I believe that I could make improvements to it, but I didn't want to be so arrogant as to believe I could make quantum leap improvements to it. I think we have made some very significant improvements, not because of the winemaking style or technique, but simply because this is my only job, and I can pay 100% attention to that wine. Greg had his own wines. He had several different custom crush wines. He had limited space, and there were just a lot of decisions were made out of practicality rather than what's best for the wine. An example would be we have 3 different clones of Cabernet. And because of space requirements, all 3 of those clones all go put together before. And then we make 2 different wines that have Cabernet in them. We make the 100% Cabernet, and we also make the boast, which we're drinking right now. So in years past, that block of Cabernet would have a bit of it peeled off, and the other varieties would go into it to make the Bordeaux blend, which is the boast. I have the ability, because it's my only job, and I have the space and the barrels to do it, to keep those 3 different blocks, 3 different clones separate. And on an annual basis, I can decide which one is best for which of the 2 wines it goes into. That's just an example of what you can do when you have your own place.
A somewhat, and you may not be able to answer this, but hearing everything that you're talking about, it's obvious that the owners wanted to take a step up. But I'm wondering why. Obviously they were doing a good job. It sounds like they had a good operation going. What was the impetus to switch things up?
I think it just was it was time to take the next step. And, in any business, what is the next step? Is it, do we take our ball and go and cash out? Do we build the next new thing and try to really build the brand? And that's what they chose to do, was to build this winery. Because of it, we've been able to pull all of our wines out of distribution. We sell all of our wine out one of the doors of the winery. All of the consumers come in and they drink it, or they buy it and they take it out the front door of the tasting room. And our wine club and our internet sales all go out the downstairs door. And so literally all of our wine is sold out the door rather than through distributorships. It allows us to be much more profitable. It allows us to be much more unique. And I think it allows us to really build a very, very loyal following.
Do you pretty much just not drink anything that you're not making yourself? Because I have a problem with steaks. I can't eat steaks. Like I very much like to. We were talking about this earlier. It's like I've gone to other places around here, and it's like I went to Barbacoa and got a ribeye there. Like thanks for trying, guys.
It's a funny thing in the wine industry. The wines that I like are more expensive than what I can afford, except for the ones that I make. So to a degree, I drink the wines that I make, but that's part of it. I'm also a bourbon. I'm actually a rye guy. I like ryes, and I like a lot of the craft beer. Particularly, I was so happy to see the IPAs make a comeback because I was an IPA guy 40 years ago. So
ahead of the curve, skinny jeans and all.
And I was an IPA guy because my brewing professor back at UC Davis, Mike Lewis, used to take us to the British pubs, and I got into it way long before anybody had ever heard of IPAs. I drink wine, but it's not my only beverage.
I actually I just picked up a bottle of the Basil Hayden rye last night just to have in the house because a friend of mine was saying he really enjoyed it. I don't know if you and my dad ever did hang out, but he told me he wanted to go to San Francisco to go to medical school, specifically because they had a bunch of little pubs and stuff you could drink at. You guys must have been drinking together at some point.
We probably had a class together or two.
Yeah, for sure.
Speaking of crossovers, I was going to mention a good friend of mine is the winemaker at Van Ruten now.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. My wife and I were actually going to have our wedding there. We ended up, the officiant at our wedding married into the Van Ruten family. Okay. He was a friend of mine. He was actually my swim coach from high school. Excuse me. Tremendous individual in my life. And, when I proposed to my wife, I'm like, well, where are we going to go? And I said, let's go check the Van Ruten spot. And they were great, but they were like, look, essentially we could do like 10 rounds, so we could get probably 80 people in here, but not much more. And we were planning on having about like 140, but yeah, their wine was fantastic. It's just, he's such a cool spot.
He's been there for a year or two now.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
New guy.
He's been around the block like I have. He's about my age, but he had an opening there, and he was like a lot of entrepreneurs, his business was struggling a little bit, so he needed to take a job, so he got that one, and he's apparently doing real well there.
Well, Van Ruten has great wine.
Yeah,
I mean and again, I'm not a connoisseur like you are, but I could tell very early on in my wine journey, like, this is really, really good. I would actually go and buy like a case of wine every few months from them and have some, for dinners and whatnot. We would always do these large Sunday dinners for the rowing team. So it was like every Sunday night we'd start cooking at like 4:00, and we're all eating like 10,000 calories a day. So these massive. One night we actually had, this is hilarious, and the Van Ruten came out for sure. But one night, a buddy was like, "Hey, my mom's got this great meatloaf recipe." So we bought something like 20 pounds of ground beef, had all of these different like bundt cake trays, that we started making these, the meatloaf earlier in the day, and walking over campus, my friend sees this girl that he knows, and he's like, "Hey, what are you doing tonight?" And she's like, "Oh, I don't know, Max. I'm not doing really anything." He's like, "You want to come over to the rowing house? We're making meatloaf tonight." She was like, "Okay, cool. Like, I'll come try the meatloaf." And the second she walked away, we were all saying, "Max, what the hell are you telling her to come over? Like, you want to come over and enjoy some spiced meat? It's going to be really, really tasty." But it was one of those nights. It was actually one of our like more successful team dinners because we just had these giant trays of meatloaf. And again, we were drinking all this wine and,
right,
having a really good time with it. Well, listen, Corey, thank you for coming and sharing. This is, it's really a treat because one of the things I learned when I was first moving here, a friend of mine had moved up about 6 years ago, and she said, look, we don't have great Chinese food in the area, but we do have really, really good wines. And it kind of struck me. It was like, why? Like, how does that work? But hearing you talk about this is like, oh, okay, I get it. You have people that are really going deep into this area of agriculture here and production. It's awesome to hear kind of what goes into it.
When I graduated from college, my roommate at the time, who was in the same major as I was, started dating a girl very briefly, and and she was a couple years younger than us. And when she graduated, she came out here and became the winemaker for Saint Chapelle. And so, Idaho has wines. I had no idea, right? This is 30 some years ago, and back then everybody was looking at Idaho as a cold climate grape growing area. Everybody's growing Rieslings, and that's that was what Saint Chapelle made their name on, was Riesling. And over time, I think people really started to realize this is not cold climate viticulture here. It's warm in the summertime, and so you can grow any number of different grapes out here. We don't grow Riesling for that reason, because everybody and their cousin has Riesling out here. We don't need to be that. So we grow a lot of different varieties. I think it started off as, let's plant a bunch of different varieties and see which ones grow best. And we've kind of come to the realization that pretty much everything grows really well out here. We've got Sauvignon Blanc, Chardonnay, Pinot Gris, Roussanne, Viognier. Those are the whites. We've got Cabernet Franc, Merlot, Petit Verdot, Malbec, all five main Bordeaux varieties, which is all in that wine you're drinking right now.
This is fantastic. And did you say this is $130?
No.
Oh, okay. I thought you said it was $100. I was like, I will never be able to afford this glass again.
No,
okay.
we're actually into the 19 vintage now, and I think it's 45.
Okay, I got a shot. Is
that right? I think the Beaujolais is 45 right now.
I'll have to come down to the ranch.
Come on out. Our restaurant is amazing. The food is fabulous. The wines are great, and the staff is amazing. And it's a beautiful location with beautiful views. There's no downside to it. So come on out.
Okay, going back to cooking. Okay, because we were talking before yeah. Okay, so you like the Traeger? You don't feel like this is cheating? The Traeger to me is literally like
it's absolutely cheating, and that's why I like it, because I don't have time to not cheat anymore.
but it's not. Okay, here's something interesting. Box cakes. Okay, it's like box. Cup of milk and an egg.
Right.
The initial makers of box cakes figured out that they could do all of the ingredients and just have the cake maker at home, whoever it is in the 70s. They're like, look, just add 2 cups of water and that's it. And it would make a great cake. And it actually did. But the problem with it is that people didn't enjoy the experience. They felt like they weren't invested enough in the process. So they're like, all right, look, let's modify the recipe. Let's make them add milk and let's make them add an egg for whatever reason. Right. Like you couldn't get a dry egg or something. So they make you add an egg and a little milk, and then you felt connected to the process. This is my issue. Like the farthest I can go is that I have a Weber gas hookup that's hard lined into my house. And you don't have to worry about the propane tank. You don't have to do anything. So like I cooked a brisket several months back, and it was like this 12-hour process. I didn't have to do anything. Like once I got in there, I was doing stuff, but I didn't worry about the propane tank. And you go one step further, you do like a Weber kettle. And gosh, man, I remember the first time I had brisket. My dad had this very good friend from Texas.
Constantly feature.
Oh God, he was up at 4:30, 5 a.m. It was for a Thanksgiving meal. And I was like, you got up at 4:30? I was like 9. I was 8 or 9 years old. I was like, you got up at 4:30? And he was like, oh yeah. I couldn't imagine getting up at 4:30 at all at 8 years old. But you go down this, pain process where you add layers and you add difficulty and you add investment from the user standpoint. And it feels like you're more connected to the end product. I have a dear friend in California right now, this guy, Mike Choi. He, no joke, has a pull behind trailer wood smoker that he just has it at his house. He wanted to give it to me. I was like, Mike, I can't. I don't have time for this. But he will literally get real hardwood, and get this whole, and he just dances with this meat. for hours, like a whole day. So for me, the Traeger, it's kind of like, dude, you're like a McDonald's McSandwich or something.
There's so much more to it than just feeding the charcoal to it. And the reason that I like it personally is I can get home from work at 5:30 or 6 o'clock at night and still get out there and get it fired up and get something really tasty made off of it. And I can do it on a weeknight. There's, when you're, I did a turkey on the Traeger for Thanksgiving. 3 hours on low smoke, 2 more hours on high heat. It was fantastic.
I bet it was.
And honestly, if your guests like what you're eating, I don't care if I cheated a little.
Look, but okay, hang with me. A buddy of mine on my street, and we all cook and we all share. Like a friend was doing like these burnt ends for 8 hours the other day, and he brings them. But another friend who's not adept at cooking gets this Traeger. He gets a rub, and he was like, "Dude, he was like, oh, it was easy, piece of cake, no problem." And he brings out this meat, and he's like, "I rubbed it, I put honey on it, I put it in there for 3 hours, and then I turned it up for 1 more hour, and called it a day, and this is what came out." And my kids, I've never seen my children eat protein so ravenously. They're like, "Dad, it's like candy. It's like a marshmallow, but it's beef." And they're just shoving it in. And it kills me. Like a little part of me died inside. I'm like, here, I put all this effort in. And he literally is like, I put the seasoning in a bowl. I rolled the meat through it. I drizzled honey on it. And then I stuck it in this smoker for like 4 hours. Just turned a knob.
I think there's a certain amount of luck going on there, because I can tell you from firsthand experience that doing a really good brisket on a Traeger is not a piece of cake. It's every bit. You still have to trim the meat. You still have to season the meat. You still got to get out there and spritz it. You've got to run it. You've got to bag it through the stall. You've got to do all the same things that you do.
This guy doesn't know what a stall is. He has no idea about evaporative cooling. I'm the one that knows. And he's like, I just put the rub on it and I turn the knob and we're good. Like,
so I guess I like the Traeger because it's got aspects of both. You can get out there and do it in a really complicated fashion, like doing a brisket or something where it's a tremendous amount of work and you got to go through all the steps. And yeah, it's feeding the pellets for you rather than you having to feed the charcoal and everything else. And it is programmable. You can watch the temperature on your phone, but you're still having to go through the majority of the work. But also, I can go out there and fire it up at 350 degrees and grill some chicken in 15 minutes. So
God, I know. I understand. I get it. This is my thing. All right. For 4th of July, I did an entire pig. Okay. Now, when I say I did an entire pig, I mean that I went down to Gem State, Meat Co. in Garden City, and I picked up a 5-foot frozen pig. I couldn't even fit it in the back of my stupid Highlander. The snout was literally poking out the back. Like you could see, if you were driving behind me, you just see this frozen pig snout. It was ridiculous, right? So I get it home. I made a smoker because Michael Pollan, the food author and ag author, is actually a client of mine. I worked with his son to help him get into college, and they invited me for this, they roasted a pig, and he had built a contraption. So I go home as 26, 27-year-old Matt, like we were saying, like, oh, I can do this. Like, I got this, no problem. And I make a smoker. So it's 2x4s, canvas top, this whole ridiculous thing. And to smoke the pig for 4th of July this last year, we started the night before, July 3rd. I have this whole pig set up. I'm sliding charcoal. I'm watching the charcoal. The heating mechanism for my smoker is literally trays, reusable baking trays. You got to pull out. You got to reload them with the briquettes. You got to wait for the wrong smoke to be done until you get the right kind of smoke coming out of it. And then you throw some chips on, put it back in. But you're feeding this bad boy, and I have a gauge, You're feeding, and so when the pig is finally done at 2:00 on 4th of July, and I, rip off the tarps and we start tearing it apart, you can't even pick the pig up. You can't pick up a single piece. It's all falling apart. Like, that is a piece of me. That is a piece of my life in that pig.
I get it. And for me, the choice to get the Traeger was that I've got very limited bandwidth. I love to cook. I do all the cooking at home. I've been cooking since I was 18 years old. But I have such limited bandwidth because I've got a job that takes a lot of time. I've got kids. I now have my grandkids in town, and it was just a way to kind of narrow that bandwidth requirement and still be able to come up with a good product.
Do you, like I was saying, I feel like I'm, when I do the pig, I feel like I'm giving people a piece of myself because again, it's a custom smoker, custom mechanism. Like I spend all this time. So when we do that pig, I'm like feeding people. It's like this took a long time and people didn't understand how it was working. I mean, people were walking, like, there's a pig in there. Like, what are you talking? So when I'm drinking this wine, which is fantastic, is it like me drinking a piece of your, year or, 2 years or 3 years?
Yeah. I think I feel that way, and I really appreciate it when people look at it that way. Chris is a good example. He's just raves over our wines, and of course he's raved over wine since before I was there. Of our wines, this is a 2018 wine we're drinking right now. I did not make this wine. I started in 2019. But well, yeah,
I take back everything I said. It's trash.
No, it's a fabulous one. But yeah, there's a piece of me in all of it, and I appreciate when people recognize that.
I used to work with for almost 20 years. I was in education. That's all I did from the week I graduated college until January 2022 when I moved here, and that was it. Cut ties. But I was thinking about some of my students. One guy in particular, this guy Hugh, I helped him. I grew up in Concord, in NorCal, not a great area.
Very familiar.
Yeah, not great. Went to Concord high schools, not great. And I did make it to Berkeley, which I was very pleased about. I'm not a hippie or liberal at all, so it was very hard for me to stomach going to Berkeley, but I did it because it was a good school. But again, he was one of my last batches of students, and I helped him go from the Concord area to Yale. He got into Yale. And I was thinking about him just a couple days ago. It's like, man, Hugh's got a little piece of me. And I realized very early on that he was this very honorable, good man. He was young, right? 17, 18. So he's young, did some stupid things, totally fine. Love him for it, totally fine. But he's walking around at least in part because of the effort I put into him. He's going to Yale. He's going to have a distinctly different life because he was able to get into that school. And I was a tiny part of that, right? Like his parents raised him, but it's just cool seeing something that you were part of manifest in the world.
I understand that. I was a scoutmaster for 15 years, and I've got 13 or 14 Eagle Scouts, including my two sons. And a few of those boys Dad wasn't really in their life. And so, and they're all very successful now. And I feel like, to some small degree, like you do, that there's a little bit of me in them because I was able to be that sort of dad figure for a few years in their life. So,
man, this got intense. Let's get the cameras. Hey, Corey, thank you for coming. I so appreciate you.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
I love the wine. I want to taste the wine that you made next time. And my wife and I will have to find a way to ditch our kids and come up and hang out with you. It's hard. I got 3 boys. They're intense. They require a lot. But yeah, I mean.
Well, in the summertime, you can come put them on the lawn.
Oh, that'd be a great idea.
Yeah.
Let them run around.
We ask you that you keep the kids with you because there's some pretty steep drop-offs, but.
Yeah, I don't want to lose any of them. I mean, I got 3. I could lose 1, I guess, but I can't lose 2. Can't lose 2.
Yeah, you don't want to make that choice.
No, for sure not. Corey, thanks for coming. I appreciate it a lot.
You're welcome.
Quick shout out to our sponsor, C Squared Social. C Squared Social is the leading expert in social media marketing and creative marketing. They have fantastic platforms. I have been a client of theirs for some time. I cannot recommend them highly enough. C Squared Social for all of your social media and creative marketing needs.
Can you still recall